Welcome back. We're just going to finish off the worksheet from the company law section on control of the company with the overall summary of that particular question. Have we decided who actually controls the company? So we're in this worksheet now, just bringing it up to where we left it. The first question we've got is the control with the shareholders or directors. Now this question is not as obvious as it may appear. You need to go back to that first question of what we mean by control. If we mean day-to-day control, then we know that the directors have an obligation to manage or supervise the management of the company. And the shareholders, they have their control exercised through their voting rights, the rights attached to their particular shares, and the controls that they have created within the Constitution. So break your answer down into the two aspects. The control shareholders have via their voting rights and Constitution, and the control directors have via their management rights, particularly under Section 128. Now the second question, how much direct management control of the company do shareholders have? Now again, we know the answer to this in the theoretical sense. It should be none, but the shareholders may exercise a degree of control, again through the Constitution. Now where this takes us to is the third question, can shareholders have a right to directly control the actions of directors in the Constitution? So can they make rules in the Constitution that limit the directors' actions or put even more direct control in the hands of shareholders? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. Now, if we go back to a diagram we looked at earlier in these companion videos, we have this statement here. We looked at control, broke it into directors and put it into shareholders, and we talked about no day-to-day role, but they create rules that limit or control the directors, and they have the potential to give themselves specific powers through the Constitution. So if we then break this down a little bit and we start saying, well, what rights do shareholders have? Now we'll just change our color a little bit there and go back to black. So our shareholders. Oh, it's got a spell checker these days, doesn't it? And then we think about our directors. Now we know they have day-to-day power. Now, for example, they can employ people, they can borrow money, they can buy assets, they can enter contracts, e.g. joint ventures, they can have major transactions with special resolutions. When we turn back to the shareholders, their issues that they can vote on appointments, vote on other issues. We'll talk about those later. And they can, in addition to that, create the rules under the Constitution. Now, if we think about these rules they might create, what sort of rules would you actually create within a Constitution? Now, let's look at the rules we actually have on the other side to employ people. So can we put some limits on these? So employing people, we might say the directors cannot employ senior managers. That must be done a committee of shareholders. We could also say let's limit their borrowing. So borrowing to a maximum of, let's say, $100,000 for a reasonable sized company. Then we might go, what about buying assets? And we could say no capital assets over $250,000. Now these are arbitrary figures just by way of example. Now, when we take this a little further, do we want to limit their powers in relation to joint ventures? So we could, for example, say no joint ventures worth over, say, 10% of company sales without approval of shareholders. Now, when we start looking at these particular examples, we can ask the question, are the shareholders taking over the powers of directors? Are they in fact acting as directors? Now, I'll just pick up some of the spelling errors here. Now, why would we be so concerned about that? And the reason is, if we go back to the definition of directors, which is under here about directors and their powers, and we go to meaning of director, and we've talked about this in directors, we had a number of people who are considered to be a director. One is the person who is occupying the position of director. Now that of course would be the person whose name is listed on the company's register, or a person who acts as director within the company openly. Then we get these second level of people who are exercising control over the company that directors normally would exercise. And how do they do it? Often by telling the directors what to do. So here we have a person in accordance with whose directions the directors are required or accustomed to act. Now, that, for example, could be in a family business where the parents sell the business to the children become directors, the parents resign as directors, but they continue to attend board meetings, they always have their say, and they pretty much tell everybody what to do. They would be deemed directors. Now, this third one down here is a person who exercise or entitled to exercise controls which, apart from the Constitution, would fall to be exercised by the board. Now, if we turn back to our example on here, and we just ask the question, well, are the shareholders giving themselves powers that really should be exercised by the directors? Now, the answer to that, if you go through them one by one, is some of them are and some of them aren't. So if we, for example, have a look at this first one up here, cannot employ senior managers. Now, that's a day-to-day power of directors. So they're clearly taking that power from the directors and giving it to the shareholders. Just make that a little bit smaller. Now, borrowing to a max of $100,000, no capital assets. Those are simply rules, right? So those are rules that are limits. That's very much like coming up to the traffic lights and there's a stop sign, so we simply obey the stop sign. However, when we look at this one down here, it's a lot like the first one. It's saying the directors cannot do this. The power is going to be transferred back here. So that's like a traffic op standing at the lights with a gloves on and directing people as to where to drive. In other words, we've gone past the point of simply imposing a rule which says don't do this, to saying I will tell you if you can do this and how to do it. So that is pretty much saying these two things here are not going to be a problem, but this and this are going to fall quite squarely under this definition here, because the person who exercises entitled to exercise controls, or entitled to control the exercise of powers, which is what's happening here, which if that power wasn't in the Constitution would be exercised by the board. So again, you can see that what we're doing is transferring the power from the directors here to the shareholders here and here. And that means for those two actions, for only those two actions, The shareholders are going to be a director when they do it. Right? So they will be deemed to be directors for those actions. Okay, now, if we go back to our worksheet, then when we look at this question, can they have the right to directly control the actions of directors? Well, we can see from those rules in the Constitution they can, but if they do it, are they going to be responsible and therefore liable for those decisions? Now, this is not dissimilar to Section 7 in the 17, in the Partnership Act of Holding Out, where a person is liable for a specific decision, as is the case with shareholders and those particular decisions we're just looking at. They are deemed directors only for those decisions. So let's say the company was entering into a joint venture with a competitor to create a new line of products, and they were going to share the market, share their customers, and share some resources. So it's a significant transaction, and the directors can't make that decision, so they go to the shareholders and ask them to confirm it under the Constitution. And the shareholders vote on it, and 60% of them agree, 40% don't. So the resolution's passed, so the directors are now authorised to do it. Now, that means, for the purposes of these sections, and those ones there are the duties of directors to act correctly, professionally, not recklessly, the shareholders will be considered to be directors. So if that joint venture goes wrong, and it was a decision that no reasonable director would have entered into, then the directors of the company and the deemed directors, the shareholders, will be potentially personally liable for those actions. Now, this last statement here, does control equal liability? Is it true? So we're looking at examples where shareholders take control and be considered to be deemed directors. Now, they can also have control by simply putting those limits in the Constitution. So where they put these limits, these two here, they don't have liability for that. Where they go that extra little step and exercise direct power, then they become liable for their decisions. So when you're looking at this question, it may be worthwhile to think, are we talking about control or are we talking about power? Or power? Which one are we actually talking about with this? Okay, but as a basic statement, we have in law a principle that if you have control, you have power, you have responsibility. But again, be careful with what we mean by control, the difference between simply putting limits and rules in the Constitution and assuming power to make decisions. Okay.